Right chaps, listen in. I've been chatting with the boss and he said to take you a stage further in your navigation, I'm going to talk you through how to set up the radio, tune into a frequency and then navigate along that transmission. First thing we need to do though is we need to have a little talk about how we set up a transmission beacon in the mission editor. So down here I've got a Willis Jeep and what I'm going to talk about is how we set up the transmission coming from that Jeep for you then to be able to tune into that and fly your aircraft towards it. So first thing we need to do is we need to go in the mission editor and we need to go into the advanced waypoint actions. We need to set perform command and transmit message. Once you've done that, that allows you then to place in some sort of sound file, all right, from your collection, preferably in OGG format, so that you can then have something to tune into. And once you've tuned into that frequency, you will then know that you've got it tuned in correctly because you'll be able to hear the sound. All right, and I've just got a Morse code signal, as you can hear here. Cool. Next thing you need to do is you need to set a frequency for that. For reasons that will become apparent when I introduce you to the R115 receiver, all right, I've set that transmission frequency to 10 megahertz, all right, and then I've also upped the power, all right, to 1000 watts. This allows that transmission to transmit over a further distance, and when you're working on something like the channel map, that will be more than enough to cover the map and you to be able to tune into that frequency and then be able to hear it. All right, sweet. So now that that's done, what we're going to do now is I'm going to talk you through some items within the cockpit. So while this mission's up, while the mission loads up, we'll have a little chat about that. So once it loads up, we're going to jump into the navigator seat and I'm going to show you how to turn the radios on, switch on the transmitter and receiver, all right, and then tune in to a frequency. Then I'll show you in the navigational cockpit the needles that you can use to bring your aircraft on to that transmission. And then once we've done that, I'll give you a brief introduction onto how that you can use radio signals, all right, in order to get a bearing from where that transmission is coming from and then bring your aircraft onto that bearing. So now that we're in the cockpit, we're going to jump across to the navigator seat, and then what we're going to do now is show you how to turn on the radios. So looking down here, you'll see we've got this brass fuel tap, all right, and just underneath there where that brass fuel tap is, there are two switches, and what we're going to do is we're going to turn both of those on. Once that's done, next thing we need to do is fold down the navigator's headrest. All right, and to do this, just by the navigator's handguard there, what we're going to do is press the silver button and that folds flat. From there then, we've got access to the radios in the back of the aircraft, and we need to turn the transmitter, tongue-tied, we need to turn the transmitter onto standby. Once that's done, we can look at the R115 receiver, and we've got a few buttons and switches we need to flick on here as well. First thing we're going to switch is this area here, and we're going to turn that round to visual. Then once we've done that, we're going to turn this switch over here, which is just off to the left hand side of the receiver, and we're going to flick that round to DF, which is for direction finder. Now that that's set to direction finder mode, you'll see that the tuning indicator is illuminated green. What we're going to do next is we're going to tune the receiver into 10 megahertz, and as we do that, once we've tuned into 10 megahertz and we've picked up the radio signal, we should see the tuning indicator green light change slightly. So the way in which we do this, we've got a fine tuning and we've got a coarse tuning knob on the front of the receiver, and what we're going to do now is move that around to 10 megahertz, which is just up here, as you can see where the yellow cross is. Sweet. So let's do that then. As I'm turning the coarse tuning knob, you'll see that the needle is starting to move around the frequency range, and we're going to move that all the way around to 10 megahertz. Talk quietly amongst yourselves while I do this. Okay, now that the needle is getting close to the 10 megahertz range, if you just pay attention now to the tuning indicator, you'll see once I get to 10 megahertz, you'll see that the green light will change slightly once we pick up the fix of the radio transmission. I'll just show that again. So we're tuned into 10 megahertz, and we can hear the transmission sound coming through the radio set. This is going to get frightfully annoying while I talk through the rest of the lesson, so what we can do here is we can decrease the volume, and we can get rid of that. Alright, now that we've got the radio tuned in, I'm going to show you the needles towards the front of the aircraft. So just above the bomb selection switches, alright, you'll see that the radio navigation needles are right here, just above it. Now, the centre line of the direction finder represents the nose of the aircraft, and then obviously you've got the left and the right, alright, of the aircraft's orientation. So you'll see that my two needles have crossed over towards the left-hand side of the aircraft. What that means is, to bring your aircraft onto where that transmission is coming from, you'll need to turn the aircraft to the left. And then obviously if the needles crossed over on the right hand side, then you would obviously turn the aircraft over to the right, in order so that the needles drop onto the centre line. Cool. However, now that we've got the radio tuned in, we've got to make allowances for a little bit of magnetic variation and all that sort of stuff. So before we can accurately use the needles to navigate towards a frequency, we need to make sure that the needles are balanced. So to do this, if we go back round to the receiver, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this switch here to the balance setting. Once that's done, if you look back down here, you'll see that the needles are crossing towards the centre line, but they're not quite over the centre line bang on, right? Which isn't very good for us, because then we lose accuracy as we're flying towards that frequency. So what we need to do is we need to tune the needles in. We do this by adjusting the meter balance dial, which is up here on the top left hand side of the receiver. So I give that a little tweak, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to check back and see that the position of where the position of the needles are. As you can see now, the needles have moved slightly further towards the centre line, but it could be a little bit better. Another little tweak. Cool. They're now balanced and spot on. So what I'm going to do now is flick the switch over to the visual position, and now the needles are still pointing over towards the left hand side, so we know we need to bring the aircraft over towards the left until those needles cross over the centre line. However, it's a little bit more accurate now because we've balanced the needles before we've continued our journey. Doing a bit of reading into this, the balancing should only be needed to do once. So as part of your startup checks, the navigator should be balancing the needles once you've got your frequency tuned in. However, once that's done, that should be you good for the duration of the mission. Alright. So we know the aircraft needs to be turned to the left towards the transmission. Not a problem. As you start to get close to where the centre point of where that transmission is, you've got this switch here, which is meter deflection, and what we can do is we can set that to from low up to high, and this will give us increased accuracy to get absolutely pinpoint onto where that transmission is coming from. So if I flick that across to high now, you'll see that the needles have crossed right over towards the left there. Alright, so there's quite a significant turn required to bring the nose of the aircraft in line to where that transmission is coming from. Initially, I'd recommend keeping it setting on low, but then using your navigation that you've been practicing, as you approach close to where that transmission is coming from, you can flick that across to high to get a really good fine tune on where that transmission is coming from, to get a nice accurate run onto the target. Okay, so that's tuning the radio done, and we've spoken about the needles, how we balance the needles, and then how we can use those needles to navigate towards a radio transmission. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how you can use the direction finding antenna in order to get a rough bearing of where that transmission is coming from. So the direction finding antenna can be found just above the navigator's head, and then what we need to do is free the antenna by undoing the lock, and then what we can do now is we can move this direction antenna to a position where we pick up the signal. Now what we're going to do now is try and tune the antenna in from where the transmission is coming from. So to do this, I'm going to move the directional antenna, and as I do so, I'm going to check the needles at the front of the cockpit, and what I'm looking for is trying to get those needles to cross over bang on the center line. Once I've done that, it needs a little bit more tweaking. Once I've done that, let's have a little look. A little bit more. Gentle tweak there. Oh, a little bit more. Oh, as you can see there, I've gone a little bit too far. So let's try and go back the other way. My mistake, your fault, as they say. There we go. So we've got our bearing now, and those needles are crossing pretty much smack on over the centre line. So it is a little bit fiddly. It's not something you want to do on your own. Definitely need a navigator to help you with this. So that's almost smack on now, and I make that bearing about 164 degrees. Ooh. So I make that bearing about 164 degrees, so it gives us a rough estimate of where that transmission is coming from. So if I jump into the mission editor now, not the mission editor, the F10 map, and take a quick bearing from where the aircraft is to where the transmission is coming from. Okay, you'll see that we've got a bearing there of about 158, 157 degrees to where that vehicle is and where that transmission is coming from. However, bear in mind that that is a grid bearing, so the aircraft has picked up the transmission as a magnetic bearing, and obviously we've got to change the variation for that. So obviously if we're going from a magnetic bearing to a grid bearing, we get rid, yeah? So if I jump back into the cockpit now, you'll see that the bearing that we had before is slightly off. So it's not the most accurate way of transmitting towards a beacon in the world. All right, the needles using the R115 is a lot more accurate, but that's just a basic overview of how the direction finding antenna works. Just set that back to 0, block that off. Alright, and now our needle should be pointing towards the left, as you can see there, which is in the direction of where the transmission is coming from, which is just off the left wing. That there concludes a basic introduction to the transmitter and the direction finding antenna. Moving on from that, we can use a lead aircraft to transmit a frequency, and then the other aircraft within the squadron can then close in on that aircraft using one of the Mosquitoes in the squadron as a pathfinder aircraft. However, this is just a very basic generic overview of how to switch the radios on, tune into a basic frequency, and then use the direction finder needles as the navigator to assist the pilot in navigating towards a frequency, towards either a target or a home base location.